Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this UK ABC roundtable on the race to rebalance global value chains and the ways of attracting manufacturing talent in ASEAN. It's a real pleasure to have two of UK ABC's partners on the call, Michael Page and David Wijeratne from PwC. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Andy Bento, who's the Regional Managing Director for Asia Pacific at Page Group. And as you know, Page Group are the global recruitment and resourcing company. But I did just want to say, first of all, that everything you hear today is current. We've been watching this situation for a couple of years now, and we think the timing is now good to talk about this whole area of rebalancing in a post-pandemic world. Andy is, as I say, the Regional Managing Director at Asia Pacific for Page Group. He's had a distinguished 30-year career with the group, and half that time he's been in Asia, in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And today he runs the Page APAC board and directs a team of over 1,000 people across Asia Pacific. It's a great pleasure to introduce Andy and the team. So Andy, very many thanks to you, and over to you now for the rest of the webinar.
Great, thanks for that, Ken, and for your very kind introduction. Just a quick word on how we're going to structure today's conversation. To start with, David will present PwC's work on rebalancing global value chains in Southeast Asia. And then Paul will follow this up with analysis of the current data we hold at Page Group, specifically related to recruitment. In the second half of the webinar, we'll move on to a Q&A, and the chat box is now live. So please don't hold back on any questions or comments. It'll be great to have as many as possible that we can put to the panel around halfway through. So what are we trying to do today? We want to examine how the rebalancing of supply chains in Asia has created this competition for scarce resources, with a focus on human talent in particular. And we'll look at current employment trends and also comment on the future of work in the region. So David, I'm going to start with you. It's my pleasure to introduce PwC's David Wijeratne. David leads PwC's international growth practice, a global team focused on supporting organizations on areas such as market expansion, global location analysis, international sourcing, global talent strategies, and international trade. So over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Andy, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here. As Andy says, I lead PwC's international growth practice, and as you can well imagine, in that role, we have been working with a number of companies across the world as they look to understand whether their current business model is relevant in midst of all the disruptions and events that they are facing. And it's been quite interesting to hear from our clients and also, how we're responding to them. So I'd like to maybe just dive straight in and present a view that we have on what our clients and what companies are experiencing in the world today. So we just go to the next slide. I think for many of you who sit in leadership positions, you're probably experiencing two things. First of all, from what you see on the left-hand side, some of these macro trends, or at PwC what we call the mega trends, or what's really shaping the next 20 to 30 years from a global economy, new consumer markets, new supplier markets, AI, rising costs, ESG, all of these sort of macro but strategic fundamentals. But probably what's actually keeping you awake or filling your email boxes is what's on the right-hand side, the disruptions, and particularly those in the red area, which are coming from whether it's political, economic, environmental, health, sadly conflict, or even financial, really causing things to be quite disruptive and getting companies to question whether the business model they've had for the last 25, so 30 years is really relevant for tomorrow. As companies have these discussions with themselves, as we move to the next slide, the first place where they tend to start is these events create a number of risks, and quite often they come to PwC with the most prominent risks that they're hearing about or they're concerned about. A lot of what they're seeing in the media or reading in the news. But actually, what they also ought to be looking at is also some of these everyday risks, which we'll see on the next slide. Some of these are strategic, the operational, the financial, and the compliance risks, because quite often the large and well-known and prominent risks obscure some of these things which are sitting within the value chains across the world for many companies. The companies can take a holistic view, an enterprise, risk-wide approach to this, or even something which is a little bit more hypothesis-based to address this. But it is important not to be swayed or let's say completely obscured by all the prominent risks, but actually pay attention to the details in particular. But if you only look at the risks and you look to rebalance your business model, you're really actually protecting what you have today. So important in this rebalancing conversation, as we'll see on the next slide, is to focus on where the future value pools lie. So two elements go into rebalancing is first of all trying to understand what are the risks and how to mitigate them and somewhat protect what you have or think of how else to reorientate to protect that, but also look to tomorrow. Where are the consumers? Where are the value pools for tomorrow? And how might you supply those? Those two create the ingredients to what you might look to design as a business model going forward. The risk element and mitigating that, but also identifying the opportunity areas and using those as elements going forward. So if you take those two components, and if we go to the next slide, we find that a lot of companies begin to understand that yes, they appreciate that things have to change. Companies that have gone through a bit of an evolution of saying, well, is this decoupling? Is this de-risking? That's gone through a bit of an evolution to now it's actually rebalancing. I think if any of you have been following what perhaps the rhetoric in the US have started off with decoupling or building a wall around certain risk areas or risk countries, that really wasn't seen to be too effective and actually didn't solve the problem. De-risking is once again seems to only solve one of those components. It's really about protecting what you have today, but going forward is really how do we balance for future growth. And you can see on the right hand side, key to this, for many companies is really the supply chains and the value chains that link their businesses to their consumers and their suppliers and manufacturing. Many companies at this point of the conversation go, yep, we understand this. So what's new, really? But if we go to the next slide, please. That's the very point, is that actually the number of companies that are beginning to talk about this is literally into the tens of thousands. You can see some of these very prominent companies you heard about, but that are beginning to rebalance away from certain regions and towards not just one location, but multiple locations. So a move away from China and Central Asia, but not to just one location such as Southeast Asia, but moving to Southeast Asia, Middle East, Eastern Europe, Latin America, a rebalancing of the global supply chain, a regionalization of the global supply chain, getting closer to suppliers, and in somewhat trying to de-risk the challenges there. So the point, if we move to the next slide, please, is really that there is a race. The sheer volume of clients that are looking to find new locations for their manufacturing, identify new suppliers to help them connect and supply those new manufacturing locations, but also to identify the talent pools, as we'll really spend most of today talking about, to support the rebalanced and new business models that we have. So there's a race on for each of these three key components or key asset areas. So we move to the next slide, please. We've seen, as I said, that this is not new. This is happening, as Ken said, and this, a lot of the work that we're showing you today is based on the fact that a number of the client names that you can see are companies that PwC has been supporting over the last 18 months or so with their own rebalancing activities. What it has done is that it has created a demand for those locations and suppliers and talent pools to a point that it's getting very difficult to serve the sheer volume of companies that are looking for each of those sort of asset areas. Compelling this challenge is what governments are doing. as I'm sure many of you are aware, governments are keen to bring companies into their countries as companies for the first time in decades start to think about where they might locate different parts of their businesses. The governments are keen to attract them to their countries, whether it's what we've heard is happening in the US or Europe, or even in this part of the world, governments are trying to attract companies by ways of incentives. Now, an incentive is seen to be appealing from a company's perspective because it helps to offset the costs of setting up a new function, hiring new people and setting up operations. It can be seen as a golden ticket. It's true, but it's not the golden ticket, because we go to the next slide. That incentive actually commits you to be operating in that company, in that country, and setting up operations and activities there. But if you don't have the suppliers, and in particular the people, to actually start to execute and start running that new operation, you're basically in limbo. And this is where we've seen a number of companies around the world, as they begin to reorientate their business model, get stuck at this point. They've identified where to go. They know that there are suppliers and talent pools in these areas. They've acquired a very attractive incentive to locate and set up operations in that part of the world. But what they haven't done is ensured that they can secure the suppliers and talent pools which exist in these regions. And why is this? So if we move to the next and sort of final section of this part of the conversation, is that there is this race. The fact that it's highly competitive, but it's for the first time in, as I say, decades, that companies have had to actually go out and compete for suppliers and talent pools. Historically, they would go, well, I'm a large multinational, suppliers want to work with me, people want to come and be employed by us, so actually, we're used to this. That's true. However, in this environment, this time it's different, because the sheer competition there is for suppliers and talent. So what can companies do differently to attract talent and stand out from the competitors who are after the same people for their operations, their factories, their new activities? In summary, this rebalancing is global. There are literally tens of thousands of companies getting involved. It's creating a global race, a race for location, suppliers, and talent pools. And therefore, companies really do need to act differently, have something different to offer to attract and retain that highly sought after talent. At this point, I think it'd be good to understand from my colleagues at from my friends at Michael Page and Paul, what is it that companies have to do? How can they attract those talent pools and also retain them?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David. Oh, sorry, Andy, please.
Sorry, I'll introduce you, Paul. Thank you, David. And look, Paul will absolutely answer that question that's been posed by David. So our next key speaker, Paul Cooper, Senior Managing Director at Page Group, based in Malaysia. Paul established the Page Group operations in Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, so has an intimate understanding of the region. He now partners with strategic customers to closely align with their global demands in human capital. So, Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks for that. Thanks for that starter question, David. Look, I think when firms are looking to rebalance their global value chains, the word you mentioned several times was race. It is a race. It's highly competitive. And in any race, I think the standout factor for me right now is speed. There is so much happening so quickly that we're seeing not just a concentration on certain industries going through this change, it's happening on a large scale across the board. Companies, when they are setting up operations in different countries, they can import their technology, their machinery. They can probably bring in some senior management talent, but the reality is they're going to need skilled and semi-skilled labor on site very, very quickly as soon as those operations are established. And as people are going through that decision-making process and that risk evaluation, they need to know what skills are readily available and at what price. And I think that's a very, very key factor that we'll cover off. In my presentation, I'll cover off some of the insights about the talent pool across the region. I've got some sort of key points to share of what firms should take into account when they're building their talent strategy. And then I've got a couple of examples where we've seen companies being innovative and really having some good success building strong talent pools in the region. Just a very quick overview of Page Group. We've been in Southeast Asia for almost 30 years and now have offices in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines. In the top left corner of this graphic, you can see the 4 brands that our teams work across. Michael Page is the original Page Group brand, normally established as the first business in each new country we enter. It comprises 12 broad disciplines, each providing a service of a specialist area of the market. Michael Page operates at the qualified professional and management level. Page Executive is our executive search business, offering a range of search and selection and management solutions for organisations needing to attract and retain their leadership talent. The roles that Page Exec focus on typically sit at the sub-board and board level. Page Outsourcing is the group's newest brand. It was created to meet the growing demands of our clients, leveraging the internal capabilities of our recruitment teams in offering customized solutions for high volume hiring and specific project recruitment needs. Page Outsourcing recruits all levels of the market. And finally, keeping the workforce agile, which will come up in this presentation, I think, a few times. Page Contracting supplies temporary contract and interim hires, harnessing the global network of Page Group to deliver swift employment solutions in response to dynamic economic landscapes. Next slide, please. To start my presentation, I'd like to take the opportunity to share some of the insights from our 2023 Global Talent Trends Survey. There are links to the full reports later in this deck, which will be shared with you. And the links are for the whole of the APAC region, not just Southeast Asia, obviously where we're focusing today. This in-depth talent study was designed to have an end-to-end perspective of talent to reveal their mindsets, motivations, attitudes, perceptions, beliefs and values, and employment drivers, salary, benefits, skills, talent development, company culture, work-life balance, DE&I and flexibility. The study aims to improve our understanding and empathy for human capital, one of the scarcest resources in the business world. The title of last year's report was The Invisible Revolution. We've seen the most profound transformation to work culture since the Industrial Revolution. It's driven by technology. It is changing the way we work, not always in the most obvious ways. The Invisible Revolution will cover things like remote work, the gig economy, on demand, all things that are having a big impact on the demand and supply of talent in the region and all over the world. Next slide, please. The Invisible Revolution, the changes that we've seen can be broken down into 3 parts. A cultural revolution in the workplace, a shift in power dynamic from the employee's perspective, and a focus on what really matters. This shift goes beyond the economy or specific job roles. It's a lasting change in how employees see themselves in the workplace. Understanding these 3 key essentials is really going to be paramount to navigating the Invisible Revolution. Next slide, please. It's a scary statistic to start this slide. 91% of people in APAC region are open to looking for a new job, meaning only 1 in 10 can be relied on to stay in their current role for a year. Nearly half the respondents are actively looking for a new job, indicating high job dissatisfaction and openness to change. Only 6% are waiting for the economy to stabilise before considering new job opportunities. Just to emphasise that point, this survey was done at the start of 2023, coming out of the the post-pandemic era. So that point around economy stabilizing probably relates back to that timeline. This does not highlight a shift in mindset towards prioritizing personal over economic factors. The data underscores the impact of the invisible revolution on the relationship between employees and employers. This is a consistent trend year after year, indicating the lasting impact of the invisible revolution on job openness and employee mindset in the APAC region. Next slide, please. Independently from how the data is examined, the average openness to new jobs remains consistent at 91%, with only slight variations. You'll see across APAC, Japan is the exception with a lower percentage, but still 69% of openness to move jobs is very high for the Japanese market. This consistency in job openness indicates the lasting impact of where people's mindset is. The data has been cross-referenced. It's been used on a really high, really large volume of respondents, and you can see from the visual across markets, but also across a lot of different job categories, including manufacturing, supply chain operations that we're covering today. I've hopefully not scared you too much about the invisible revolution and highlighting some of those key trends. I will now move on to cover three topics which I think are really important for any company looking to base themselves in Southeast Asia and hire key talents. The three topics I'll cover: establishing your employer brand, building your value proposition, but also making sure you're managing your recruitment process effectively. And then with a little bit of time left, I'll cover a couple of case study examples that we've seen firsthand within the region. And recruitment in Southeast Asia, sorry, back one slide, please. Establishing your employer brand in Southeast Asia requires a nuanced approach that considers the cultural, economic, and social dynamics of the region. It's really important that you allocate resources to employer brand initiatives such as career fairs, recruitment marketing campaigns, and employer award programs to really increase visibility and attract top talent. I will touch on digital and social media on the next slide, but when you're looking at your employer awards and what you're trying to really do in the region, you really do need to be on the front foot and really engaging the talent. I can't emphasize enough that Southeast Asia is a melting pot of cultures, languages, and backgrounds. You really do need to put, embracing diversity and inclusion at the forefront of your hiring practices. Your company culture needs to be something you use very proactively to attract a diverse pool of candidates. And authenticity is crucial. Employer branding, people really want to know what your company is all about. They really want to understand from your messaging and actions that they align with your company's values and the culture to build trust with potential candidates and employees. Next slide, please. When you're looking to build your EVP, your employer value proposition, you do need to highlight opportunities for growth. Southeast Asia is experiencing rapid economic growth, and many talented individuals are seeking opportunities for career advancement. Highlighting opportunities for growth and development within your organization can really help you attract top talent in the region. Work-life balance is highly valued in Southeast Asia. You'll need to emphasize your company's policies and initiatives that support employees in maintaining a healthy balance between their professional and personal lives. And you will have to focus on offering competitive benefits. In addition to salary, benefits such as healthcare, including family cover, flexible work arrangements, and the opportunities to develop skills are really important considerations for job seekers in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. And this is the third point that I'd like to really focus on, because I've seen organizations do it very well, and I've also seen organizations do it very, very badly. Your recruitment process is putting your organization in the sales window. This is really important, that you're creating that very strong first impression, but all the way through the recruitment and onboarding process, you are really exhibiting the culture and the values of the organization. You can see the 4 E's on that slide, which I think really do simplify what you should be focusing on. But if I could just emphasize, this process in a bit more detail. This goes back to something I mentioned earlier on about the use of digital technology to really ensure that you're reaching a wide talent pool. It's crucial that you're leveraging social media to showcase your company, your culture, your values, and the career opportunities. But one of the things that I have seen organizations get wrong in this area is you do need to make sure that your digital strategy is mobile first. You can have a great website. You can make sure that it's, it really does bring out the culture and the values. But in this region, probably more than any other region in the world, the majority of candidates will be looking at you through the lens of their mobile device. That's where they'll see you, whether it's on social media or your own website. And I can't emphasize enough that you need to put mobile first as the big step of your digital engagement strategy for top talent. Get that right, and you've got a good chance of putting some good talent into your pipeline. But also, if the first impression from the digital experience isn't positive, you will lose a lot of people very, very quickly. Something else I always emphasize to employers entering and growing in a region is make sure you're actively learning from your employees. When you do hire, when you do get talent on board, make sure you follow up with them and understand their experience, understand what went well, understand where there are areas for improvement, because firsthand, they're the people that they've joined you. They've clearly bought into what you're saying and what you're showing. But I think it's very, very important that no campaign's perfect. No recruitment process is perfect. What could you do differently? So what I've seen successfully to run is getting new starters together and having a quick workshop and sharing those ideas, getting that download from talent to really understand the local market, the local talent pool very well, but also taking some honest feedback from the people that are in front of you that have come through that process and look to continually evolve to make sure your process is both effective and efficient. And the final point in this area is you must have one eye on the future. Of course, you're going to want to ramp up your team quickly. You're going to want to get those crucial hires into the operations and get them onboarded so you can really hit the ground running and get the operations live quickly. But you also need to build a talent pipeline. And with that in mind, your branding, your EVP, your engagement, your digital platforms, you also need to look to the medium and the long term. And there's a phrase, David, I have pinched this one from the earlier conversation we had with you in a lead up to today, but you've got to be ready to create talent, not just consume talent. Of course, coming to a new market, you are going to want to hire and staff up your operation quickly, but that's going to be the quick fix. You do need to commit, and you do need to participate in industry events, sponsor local initiatives, and probably most importantly, engage with education institutions, colleges, universities, and in some cases schools as well, to really have one eye on the future and look to build your talent pipeline, not just think about the first 3 to 6 months. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd finish my area with a couple of examples that we've seen in the region, and both of them emphasise innovative practices that some leading MNCs have utilised to really help them attract some high quality talent into their organisation. This example is focused on Thailand, and you can see the title of the slide, "Let's Go Home." Southeast Asia, most markets in Southeast Asia does have a brain drain. And quite often that happens at the university age, but then also in the early stages of people's careers, whether it's chasing international opportunities, chasing dollars in different locations around the world, or maybe somebody's gone to university elsewhere and decided to stay for another 5 to 10 years. But there is a huge opportunity to bring some of that talent back to the region. And the example that you've got on the screen here worked very well in Thailand in two ways. Firstly, it was a campaign that was structured to enable a global search for talent. And what the organization was looking for in this case was two things. They were looking to invest in female leaders in their operations, but also they wanted to localize senior leadership roles in Thailand. And to do that, they put together a very innovative recruitment campaign, a global campaign, but it was one that they put a 12, 18 months timeline on. This wasn't a quick fix. This was building their talent pipeline for the coming years. And all the roles down the right-hand side were successfully completed with talent. Half of them were returning talents, sourced from the likes of the US, from the Netherlands, Australia, within Southeast Asia as well, and Germany. But they were all returning Thais in senior and middle management roles. And the majority of those positions were also successfully filled with female talents. So look, this isn't a silver bullet. This isn't going to be something that you would solve all your hiring challenges with on day one. But it really did emphasize, having that eye on the medium to the long term, looking to really invest in local leaders, and really looking to invest in, your inclusive hiring, both in country and around the region, and in this case, globally. Next slide, please. The second example is based here in Malaysia, and it's not one that exclusively or specifically looks at manufacturing and operations, which I know is the topic for today. But Malaysia, over the years, you're probably maybe aware, has been a real hub for global business service centres or shared service centres. Initially, we saw a lot of it focused on finance, HR, and technology, but there's been a real shift now towards procurement and supply chain. And one of the things that in this example, Kerry Foods, in building its operation here in Malaysia, did was really look at how it focused on building up the employer brand, the employee value proposition, and some really excellent work building up that digital footprint in the talent pool. So a lot of work was done on social media. Taking my point from earlier, it was a mobile first initiative, really looking to engage talent at all levels, and really building the talent pipeline, not just for the first year, but as you'll see, one that enables the organization to really expand and grow its operations here in Malaysia through a number of different stages of hiring and expansion. Next slide, please. And here's my final slide. I mentioned earlier on the talent trends, the invisible revolution, the survey we ran and published the reports last year. All the links you can see here are the embedded links, not just to Southeast Asia, but all of the talent trends report across the APAC region. Back to you, Andy.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the spotlight on Southeast Asia and some really good pointers there on how to attract and retain top talent in the region. And I think we've now got a better awareness of the people and the communities from which they come. Linked in with that point, Paul, the question we often get is how open are candidates in Southeast Asia and maybe even broadly within Asia? How open are they for relocating for job opportunities? Because that can often play a big part in finding the relevant talent within these countries.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Look, I'd probably look at mobility and relocation at three levels. Obviously, throughout the pandemic, international mobility and international relocation just wasn't a thing. It's now back and it's happening again. And certainly candidates in Southeast Asia are mobile. I think we've seen at different levels of people's professional career, so at different stages, there are maybe a different level of mobility internationally. But there's probably two other areas that I'd focus on. One is domestic mobility. I mean, outside of Singapore, you're talking about 5 very large economies, very large countries, where people will move within the country. People will maybe move from the cities back to their hometowns on a permanent basis. But we also see people that are more than happy to do a Monday to Friday live away commute. So actually be away for a week or maybe a few weeks at a time. And I think that's in particularly relevance to manufacturing operations, where in many cases the facilities aren't in a city or on the city outskirts. They might be in quite rural and quite remote locations. And so there won't be a ready-made talent pool on the doorstep at all levels. But I think that opportunity to have domestic mobility, people moving around the country and relocating themselves, or maybe people taking on those short-term, week-to-week, month-to-month live-away opportunities, I think there's a big way to tap into that talent pool.
Great, thank you for that, Paul. Very, very interesting. And to the audience, please do send through any questions that you may have. We've just got a couple starting to come through now, and some that were previously submitted as well. I'm going to go to one that we had submitted by Guy Whitaker from Future Dynamic. David, this one I think may be more geared towards you. What approaches do management teams take to balance opportunity, risk, readiness, and alignment when evaluating or maybe re-evaluating the Asian supply and manufacturing chains? I guess question, what would yield better decision making or faster decision making? Can you help with that one?
Yeah. So I think there's a 4-step process to the whole rebalancing journey. If you can imagine that most companies have had their operations in place for decades, and they've really focused on the efficiencies, in enhancing productivity. So it's the first time in a number of years that companies are having to address where they source from, where they manufacture, and then also how they address new value pools. So the bookends are beginning to move. Before you undertake that, which is a very significant transformation, is trying to understand that I mentioned 2 elements here. One is the risk element, and the second is the growth element. The growth element is relatively simple: identify and evaluate growth value pools. The risk element is the bit that is trying to understand, well, where does that risk sit in your current value chain? So I alluded to it, but in the discussion. So there's 2 ways, for example, that you can look at this. One is what you would call an enterprise-wide risk assessment, which is basically you look through your whole value chain, basically your whole business, whole value chain, and identify where the high value pools sit within your business. What parts, are they? For example, where's inventory sitting? Where are the key operational points? And what risks sit across that? There may well be risks across your value chain, but they're not sitting in elements of your value chain that are of particularly high value, or that there are elements that you can tolerate. So it's the identification of those key points that you go, actually, we have a high value pool in that area, and we see different risks coming to that. So that's pretty comprehensive. Now that with it takes a number of weeks, months actually, and you can imagine quite costly. What we are seeing, and in fact, our group are working on this with at least a couple of clients in different parts of the world, and this is what you might call the black swan event. It's basically a hypothesis approach, and you sort of look at 5 different categories of risks. So you might look at conflict, you might look at technology, financial risk, health, and environmental, and take an event for each of those, and basically run your business through that. And say, okay, if, for example, such an event happened in my current environment, how resilient or how much of an impact would that have? So if you just take a scenario that we currently are seeing, is if the conflict in the Middle East were to escalate, or the challenges around the Suez, for example, was to happen again, how resilient, how long could you hold out for, what would be the cost of 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks worth of having to reroute around, the Cape? And that's a number of days that you can work out. So that's more hypothesis based, and that's much shorter. And that enables you to have a practical insight into how resilient your business might be and what you might do to address it. It has two outcomes. One, you will have what you should do. It's like proactively, well, actually, I'm going to make these changes to my supply chain based on the fundamentals, based on where new consumer pools are and risks. But then I have a scenario for my 100-day plan. So actually, if something does happen, what do I do for those first 100 days? And one of the things that we learned from COVID is a lot of companies had what we call business continuity plans. Most companies had one for all eventualities. Now what we realize is that that's not sufficient. We need to have a plan for different types of eventualities. There may be a core, 70% of it also might be common, but it's the other 50%, the other 30% that differentiates from having a financial challenge to a technology challenge to a health challenge, environmental conflict in that regard. So a lot of companies are beginning to start with that, and that then really helps them understand where they need to remodel or rebalance towards.
Thanks, David. Very much a complicated world at the moment for sure. And bearing that in mind, with all the recent global events, global shocks that have been happening, from your perspective, what impacts are you seeing on global supply chains now?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is a move towards shortening that supply chain, that value chain between where we're sourcing and manufacturing, connecting it to consumers, customers. That thereby reduces the element of risk. It also enables you to have a speed to client and be a lot more agile. So that's why I think you saw a slide. One of my slides showed a lot of activity around Eastern Europe. Well, that's really to serve European customers, Western Europe, etc. A lot of those customers were being served from suppliers, manufacturers in Asia Pacific, and then being shipped across to serve customers in Europe. We're seeing key components of the value chain getting a lot closer to the end consumer. So you have your supplier, you have their supplier coming together, saying, well, if we're going to move to Hungary, I'm just using a different geography, please can you come closer with us as well? So it's a lot more focus on that, and also regionalization. So trying to go from what we had historically was a global supply chain where there's few suppliers as possible, erring towards efficiency. Now the focus is upon resiliency, but also trying to make sure that resiliency doesn't have an element of fat, you might call it, which makes it redundancy. And redundancy is not a word that companies like to hear because basically it's money tied up. So how do you ensure that you have a least amount of risk, but also ensure that you're actually having value with that? So that's where you get the regionalization, shortened supply chain.
Great, thanks, David. A couple for Paul that we've got. Thanks for sending questions through the group. Firstly, Noel from BDO. Just one around, do companies in Southeast Asia look at bringing in expat talent, I guess, to sort of lead some of these changes in their supply chains? How much are we seeing of that these days, Paul?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Noel. Yes, look, I think employers are open to it, but I think we've touched on risk a few times in this presentation already. I think there's definitely a trend now that people are reluctant to hire first-time expats. So, when I arrived in the region maybe 12, 13 years ago, you would see people where they would move jobs, move companies, and land in Southeast Asia because there was a talent shortage and people were looking to bring that talent into the market. I think now with the local talent pools, with, as I highlighted in Thailand, returning talent from overseas, and also talent, expats that are already in the market, I think to go outside of that, companies would really look for people who have landed somewhere before, people who have got the experience of being able to do their role outside their home country. So I think there's a risk adversity to first-time expats landing in Southeast Asia. Maybe Singapore in maybe the banking industry could be slightly different, but But certainly in manufacturing operations, I think it's be quite rare to hire somebody and looking at bringing them into a region that they've never worked in before, and they had very limited experience outside their own country.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And there's a cost element as well, often involved, isn't there, Paul? Which I think a lot of companies bearing in mind these days. And just while I've got you there, a good question from Kojala. One of the challenges in Southeast Asia is how industry, government, and academic institutions interact to address the talent gap. As we know, it's just often very hard to find the right quality and experience of talent within the region. Do we think this has changed as much? And so are there any Southeast Asia countries doing this better than others?
I think there's I can highlight two countries that I've worked in, which is Malaysia and Vietnam. In both of those markets, I've partnered with, in Malaysia, the British Malaysia Chamber, and we've done exactly that. We've brought together the government, the education body, we've brought together the academic institutions and some leading industry employers as well, to really focus on, I guess, two areas. One is getting talent industry ready. So trying to get young professionals, people leaving the academic world, equipped with the soft skills, equipped with the digital skills that they're going to need in the workplace. Now that's not going to change overnight, but they're certainly looking at how do we grow that. The second thing is reskilling and upskilling of existing talent. And I'll share an example of one of the big international, one of the big global banks that's very prominent in the region. Of course, banks are going through a huge change where they're closing branches. They don't need a lot of the teams that they've had historically, but at the same time, they need to hire a lot of people in the new banking world with digital skills, and that's proved a real challenge. So we're also seeing a lot of initiatives across the region of upskilling and reskilling people already established in their career, because their job will go. Their job's under threat from technology and the digitalization, and therefore, academic institutions, some of the tech providers, and also government bodies are looking at, how do they invest in that talent pool and reskill them for the future.
Thank you. And David, do you want to come in on this one as well? So you got your hand up.
I just thought I'd use the technology here.
I
would just add, out of those three, it's business led, right? It's enabled by government, and obviously it's delivered through academic institutions, but it absolutely is business led, and businesses can really stand out. Going back to the original point that Paul was mentioning, from competition, by taking the initiative to contribute to the pool rather than just consume it. But it is certainly business led. They know what they need. They know what industry. They understand where their industry is going, and that's why now governments are there as a platform to facilitate it, to remove the regulation and make it work a lot more smoothly. And obviously, the institutions are the facility that delivers it through. But I would encourage any business is not to wait, but take ideas to government and the institutions, rather than going open hand and saying, what will you do? Because you know best, you know what your value chain and your customers need.
That's right. Be part of the solution, for sure. Whilst you're there, David, another one for you. I saw some examples of nearshoring, particularly in Europe, and obviously that's something that's been spoken about a lot in the last couple of years. Is this a trend that will continue, or just the growth and a platform in Asia simply outpace that in the longer term?
I think it's really going to go back to some of those fundamentals I put on the first slide, really, right? Whereby historically most companies understood where their consumer pools lay, and they were kind of structured for a number of decades, and they understood where they were sourcing and manufacturing from. Those are moving, right? But of course, the historical value pools, customer pools, are still there as well to a large extent. So your value pools are becoming fragmented. New suppliers are entering the market, so that's also becoming fragmented. So it's actually providing you multiple options, but also multiple pools to address. So naturally, it's going to become more regionalized, which went back to what I earlier said. It's a different era of globalization. You know, I don't think you could ever say it stopped, because internationalization, whatever term you want to use, is that consumer pools around the world can still have a desire for certain goods and services that other companies around the world have the ability to provide. It's how you connect them, and instead of it being, you know, more world to world, or end of the world to end of the world, it's now proximity and becoming a lot closer to mitigate risk, speed to consumer, and to meet demand. So I think it's just a different version, but for multiple benefits.
Yeah, interesting. It's interesting development for sure. Okay, let's move to the last couple of questions, I think, now. Paul, quite an interesting one, you know, on companies that are relocating to this region. Obviously, inflation, rising costs of living. What feel do we have for the annual salary increases that are expected currently, and then broadly across the region year on year?
Yeah, look, we're just starting to see that information come through. We're obviously in pay review and increment month in January. Look, I think we're certainly seeing a lower range than we've seen in recent years. I think typically the sort of 3 to 5% is what I've heard in most cases. That there are outliers to that in different sectors and in some locations, but broadly, I'd say 3 to 5% is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, David, I've got one more coming through here. Another one here for you. Are there any particular tools and technologies companies are using, looking to deploy as they go through this process, as they rebalance their value chains? Anything new or anything in particular that they're looking at?
Yeah, no, good question. So I would say, for a number of years, I think we've heard all about companies considering digital supply chain assets, you know, and those tools. But as I mentioned, historically, where you were selling to and where you were selling from, the supplying from, were pretty structured. So these tools were like, if you're a client going, well, what return am I going to get on the digitalization? Because I'm completely focused on efficiency anyway. Now, the fact that the bookends, as I mentioned before, are moving, well, now you've got the need for these digital tools coming into being more and more of a need, and being asked for by clients and to ourselves and companies around the world. Because as the fragmentation of the consumer pools just only gains momentum, and the fragmentation of the supply pools gains momentum, how you connect the two has become even more important, because it's not as simple as it used to be. And I think those companies that are able to connect those two as quickly as possible are those that are going to win, and are those that are going to retain and grow their consumer base. And those that don't necessarily take advantage or don't deploy tools to capture that data and link the consumers with their manufacturing and supply chains, are those that are going to get left behind. So it's coming into its own now more than ever before. The business case for having those digital supply chain assets in place, regional hubs, etc., control tower technologies you're hearing, more so than ever.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And something just come through from Guy, Paul's stat about 91% of candidates are open to move employment. Loyalty is dead. But perhaps offering up regional opportunities would strengthen engagement and retention. I don't mind covering that one as well, having done some work on this. Yeah, look, absolutely right. I think as part of almost the new contract between employers and employees these days, career growth and opportunities and certainly coaching and development is a key tool that can be used for retention. If we marry that up with broadly people in the region are okay about relocating, I think that's absolutely a good opportunity to look at. Very last quick question, Paul. Last one from Leanne from Karcher. I know this might be a tricky one to answer, but is there any country that's winning this race that's in the region that's becoming more attractive than others?
Oh, great question to finish on, Andy. Thanks for that. Is anybody winning the race? Look, having been in the region for 12, 13 years, there is still a talent drain to Singapore, but that's people chasing the dollar at the current exchange rates. It's not necessarily that Singapore's winning that race for the talent pool. So no, I'll probably sit on the fence with that one, Andy, and say, look, there's plenty of opportunity for companies and for countries to do more in building these talent pipelines, and echoing what David said a couple of times, really investing in the communities that you're going to be part of, because if your plans to be in the region for a number of years and rebalance your supply chain, then yeah, be prepared to be looking to create talent.
They're all potential winners. Great, thanks guys. I'm just going to do a quick couple of minutes summary before passing back to Ken. So look, there's no doubt we're in a new area of disruption, and we know there is no other option but to change in the current market, and clearly that's all about countering the risk or de-risking where it's necessary, and important to rebalance that portfolio focused around the three areas of location, supply, and talent. And clearly today we've had the biggest focus on talent, because realistically that's the one that's perhaps the most difficult challenge to solve. How do you win that race? I think one of the keys is to differentiate. It's a very challenging, very competitive market. COVID has absolutely changed the working landscape, as we saw from that 91% statistic. Loyalty is very hard to find, and employees just have different priorities these days. Work in the majority of cases just isn't as important in people's lives as perhaps it was before, so we have to reflect that. Still play into those three key aspects: good compensation, good career growth, and make sure you get that flexibility, play right. And that can be tricky for companies, because you've got to appeal to employees who want to be in the office, as well as those who don't, again depending on the nature of your business. So hard to balance, but a good starting point. Some of the case studies and some of the processes that Paul mentioned around being efficient, equitable, effective, and then just providing a great experience for any process that you run. So interesting road ahead. It's been fascinating for the presentations and the questions. Thank you all very much for listening and engaging. Ken, we have had a question about receiving copies of the presentation, so I'm assuming that's okay, but I'll leave you to confirm that, and back to you.
Andy, thank you very much indeed. And yes, I can confirm that we will be distributing the slides. There'll be a recording available on the YouTube channel that UK-ABC has. And of course, there's the opportunity to follow up with both PwC and Page Group. You can see there on the slide David Wijeratne and Paul Cooper's email addresses, as well as mine, in case you wanted to approach the UK-ASEAN Business Council. But please do reach out to David and Paul, because I know they're very keen to speak with you if you found today useful. I certainly have. Thank you, David, for those insights on regionalization, the shortening of the supply chain, and everything we've heard and talked around that. And Paul, being part of the solution, as Andy was saying, contributing to the pool of talent rather than just consuming it. I think for people in academia on the call, I think that brings a really important connection between the whole education system and the future talent that we bring into the markets that we serve. So please do stay in touch with those on the call, and the links that I've mentioned. Do stay in touch with the UK-ASEAN Business Council. We really have appreciated this call. speaking here both to Michael Page or Page Group and PwC. And thank you very much indeed. We close the call now.
Thanks, everyone.